The strangest part wasn't that he sat down next to me uninvited. It was that, in a room full of people who'd known me my whole life, he was the first one who actually looked at me. It was my cousin's wedding. Hazel Point Lodge, 3 hours north of Toronto, the kind of venue that exists purely so people can post photos of themselves against a backdrop of birch trees and pretend their life is a catalog. The ceremony had been beautiful in the way that ceremonies always are when you're standing outside them, watching from a slightly awkward angle because the seating chart put you at the back, beside the caterer's entrance. I'd known about the seating chart 3 weeks in advance. My cousin, the bride, the one I'd grown up sharing bedrooms with on family holidays in Muskoka, the one I'd helped pick out her prom dress in grade 11, had placed me at table 14, not table 2, where our grandparents sat, not table 5, where her university friends were, table 14. I counted. There were 16 tables. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that weddings are logistically complicated, that seating charts are a nightmare, that she was stressed and overwhelmed and it wasn't personal. I told myself this so many times on the drive up that by the time I pulled into the lodge parking lot, I'd almost convinced myself it was true. Almost. The cocktail hour was held on the deck, overlooking the lake. It was September, so the air had that particular quality it only gets in Ontario in the fall. Cool enough to make you glad you brought a jacket, warm enough that you didn't actually need it. The leaves on the far shore had just started to turn. Someone had strung Edison lights between the pine posts. It really was beautiful. I was standing near the far railing with a glass of Prosecco I hadn't touched, pretending to be very interested in the boats moored at the dock below. My heels were already hurting. I'd spent 45 minutes that morning on my hair, and it had gone flat in the car anyway. Around me, conversations braided together and pulled apart. My aunt was telling someone about her new kitchen renovation. 2 of the groomsmen were doing shots by the bar. My cousin's fiancé, her husband now, technically, was making the rounds looking relaxed and happy, in the way that men at their own weddings always manage to look relaxed and happy, as though the entire thing isn't a production of enormous emotional complexity. I sipped my Prosecco. I watched the boats. You're going to tip over the railing if you lean any further. I turned. There was a man standing a few feet to my left, close enough to have been there for a moment without me noticing, which was somehow more startling than if he'd appeared from nowhere. He was holding a glass of what looked like club soda. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't immediately classify. Not quite amused, not quite serious. Somewhere in the middle, like a person who's learned to hold both things at once. The boats are interesting, I said. They're not moving, he said. That's what I find interesting about them. He looked at me for a moment. Then he turned and looked at the boats too. We stood there for a few seconds in what should have been awkward silence and wasn't, quite. Kieran, he said without looking at me. Sorry? My name. He glanced over. Kieran. Oh. I shifted my glass to my other hand. I'm Sears. I watched him process the spelling in his head. Everyone always does. It's Irish. It sounds like Saoirse. I know how to pronounce it, he said. My grandmother was from Galway. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. How do you know the couple? He asked. She's my cousin. I nodded toward where my cousin was standing across the deck, laughing at something her new husband had whispered in her ear, luminous in a way that people only are on days like this. We grew up together. More or less. More or less. She was in Oakville. I was in Hamilton. Different enough that we saw each other at Christmas and thought we were close. I heard myself say it and felt a small, mean twist of shame. That wasn't fair. We are close. It's just complicated, the way family is. He nodded. And the boats? I just needed a minute away from the complicated. He didn't push that. I appreciated it. What about you? I asked. His side, he said. We were at Western together. I don't know many people here. You picked a strange place to stand then. This is where people come to be alone. I know, he said. And then he smiled, just slightly, just enough, and I felt something shift in the air between us in a way I didn't have language for yet. We ended up talking through the rest of cocktail hour. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a montage. It was just easy. The kind of conversation that doesn't announce itself as important while it's happening. He asked about my work. I'm a physiotherapist. I have a small practice in Kitchener. I'd been doing it for 6 years and I still liked it most days. I asked about his. He was vague in a way that didn't feel evasive exactly, just careful. He said he worked in development. Real estate, he clarified when I waited. Commercial. Toronto? I asked. Mostly, he said. There was something about the way he said it. Not dismissive, just compressed, like a word that meant more than it appeared to. When the bell rang for dinner, he held out his arm and said, "Shall we?" And I laughed, because it was such a slightly old-fashioned gesture, and then I took it anyway, because why not? He was at table 12. I was at table 14. We parted ways, and I told myself that was fine, that it had been a nice conversation, and those exist, sometimes, complete in themselves. I sat down at table 14. My tablemates were 2 of my cousin's work colleagues who'd only met each other that day. A great uncle who was hard of hearing, and kept nodding at things no one had said, and a couple from Calgary, who were friends of the groom's parents, and had spent the car ride here listening to a true crime podcast they couldn't stop discussing. They were very excited about it. They kept turning to me with fresh revelations, and I kept nodding, and the great uncle kept nodding too. And somewhere in the middle of the Caesar salad, I found myself thinking about a man I'd known for 40 minutes and his grandmother from Galway. The speeches were lovely. Her maid of honor cried. Her new husband cried a little too, very quietly, and that got to me in a way I hadn't expected. After dinner, the dancing started. I danced with my aunt, who is a remarkable dancer for someone who claims to have 2 left feet. I danced with the great uncle, who turned out to be lighter on his feet than anyone at the table. I danced with my cousin, briefly, while her husband was occupied, and she squeezed my hands and said, "I'm so glad you came," and I believed her, even though I was at table 14. Eventually, I sat back down. The Calgary couple had migrated to the bar. The work colleagues were on the dance floor. I was alone at table 14, and the Edison lights were making everything look amber and soft, and I was tired in a way that didn't have much to do with the hour. I was checking my phone. Not for anything important, just the reflex, when someone pulled out the chair beside me and sat down. "You left the dance floor," Kieran said. "My feet are exhausted," I said. I wasn't wrong. He looked at the empty chairs around us. "You've been abandoned. Everyone found somewhere better to be." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have a proposal." I looked at him. "The groom's mother has been trying to introduce me to her niece for the last 45 minutes, he said, his voice perfectly level. "She's very persistent. I need a reason to be otherwise occupied." A pause. "Dance with me, just for a while. You can tell your feet it's a professional obligation." I stared at him. "You want me to fake date you to avoid the groom's mother's niece." "Not fake date. Just be a visible alternative." He looked at me with that same expression I still couldn't classify. "It would also mean you're not sitting alone at table 14. I thought about pointing out that I was fine. I thought about explaining that I wasn't the kind of person who needed rescuing, that I was sitting here by choice, that I was perfectly comfortable. All of that was mostly true. "One dance," I said. We stayed for 4. He was a better dancer than his self-deprecating lead-up suggested. The band was playing the kind of wedding covers that are somehow better than the originals because everyone's in a good mood and the drinks have been generous and the air smells like pine. We didn't talk much while we danced. We didn't need to. Between songs, standing just off the floor while the band consulted their set list, he said quietly, "I meant to ask you earlier. Do you always watch from the edges? Do you?" I said. "Yes," he said, "but I'm usually watching for different reasons." I didn't ask what that meant. I thought I might regret not asking later. I didn't ask anyway. At the end of the 4th song, the band announced a short break. We drifted back toward the tables. He got us both water without being asked, which sounds like a small thing, and is a small thing, but small things accumulate. We sat. The lodge was quieter now, the dancing crowd having thinned to the dedicated and the drunk. Outside the windows, the lake was black and still. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Yes. Earlier, when you said you worked in development, you got, I don't know, careful." He looked at his water glass. "People have a lot of opinions about what I do." "What do you do, specifically?" A pause. Not evasive. Just a pause where he seemed to be deciding how honest to be. "I acquire properties," he said. "Underperforming commercial assets, Sometimes residential developments that have stalled. I restructure them, find them new purposes. He looked at me. I know how that sounds. Like a villain in a Hallmark movie. He blinked. Then he laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. Something like that. And are you a villain? A Hallmark villain? He considered this with more seriousness than it deserved. I've been called worse, he said finally, and better. I try to leave things better than I found them. I don't always succeed. He looked at his hands. There are communities affected by the work I do. I've gotten that wrong before. I'm trying to get it less wrong now. I believed him. I wasn't sure why. I'd known him for a few hours, and people who do things that might be called ruthless are often very good at sounding earnest. But there was something in the specific way he said, I've gotten that wrong before. Not defensive, not minimizing, just straightforward. That felt real. What made you want to do it? I asked. Start in development? My father, he said. And then he stopped. You don't know. He set down his glass. He had a business that didn't work. A small construction company, family run. He didn't make good decisions, and the company collapsed, and it took everything with it. I was 17. I watched him try to understand why it happened and not quite managed to. There was no one to help him understand the structure of what had gone wrong. He looked up. So I learned the structure. I wanted to understand the things that could make something fail so I could prevent it. For other people. And do you? Sometimes, he said. Not always. There was something in the honesty of that made my chest feel strange. We talked for another hour. I found out he grew up in Windsor. He found out I grew up in Hamilton. We had a brief, warm argument about whether either city got enough credit, which is a very specific kind of Canadian argument that I enjoy a great deal. He had a sister he was clearly close to. I had a brother I was also close to, though we'd been in a strange drifting period since he'd moved to Vancouver. Kieran listened when I talked about it, not just waiting for me to finish, but actually listening, in the way that's rarer than it should be. Around 11, my cousin found me. She was glowing and slightly disheveled in the way of brides at the tail end of their reception. And she looked at Kieran and then at me, with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. I just wanted to check you were okay, she said. And she meant it. I could tell she meant it. But she also kept glancing at Kieran. I'm good, I said. This is Kieran. He's a friend of the groom's. Hi, she said, with the particular warmth that my cousin deploys when she's also doing an assessment. I'm so glad Saoirse's had someone to talk to. She looked at me. You seemed a little earlier. I just wanted to make sure. I'm great, I said. And I was. I was genuinely great, which was strange. Because 3 hours ago I had been standing alone at a railing watching boats that weren't moving. She kissed my cheek, said something to Kieran about how lovely it was to meet him, and floated back toward her husband. Your cousin loves you, he said. I know, I said. It's just, she has a lot of people to love. That's not a limited resource. No, I said. I know. I'm working on knowing that. He nodded. No advice. No gentle correction. Just acknowledgement, which was exactly the right thing. The reception ended at midnight. The lodge staff began their quiet revolution of clearing glasses and folding linens. The last of the dedicated dancers had exhausted themselves. Outside, the parking lot was dark except for the lights over the lodge entrance. It was colder now, the kind of cold that arrives properly in September without apology. My car was at the far end of the lot. I was fishing in my clutch for my keys and finding nothing, which is a problem I have every single time I carry a clutch, because clutches are beautiful and deeply impractical. And then Kieran said, You drove up alone? Yes, I said. It's a long drive at this hour. I've done it before. I found the keys, held them up. He looked at me in the amber light from the entrance. I'd like to keep talking to you, he said, after tonight, if that's something you want. It was a direct thing to say. I appreciated that too. No ambiguity, no casual we should hang out sometime trailing off into nothing. Just, I would like this. If you would like it too. I'm in Kitchener, I said. I know. You told me. And you're in Toronto, most of the time. That's 1 hour and 20 on the 401, I said. Less, if you go early enough that there's no traffic. I looked at him. That's not a deterrent, is it? No, he said. It isn't. I saved his number. I drove home with the windows cracked and the radio low, and I thought about the way certain nights contain more than their hours suggest. How you can walk into a lodge in the Halliburton Highlands expecting nothing much, just to get through it, just to be a good cousin and eat the salmon and say the right things, and then come home changed, just slightly, in ways you don't have words for yet. He texted before I reached the highway. Just, drive safe. 2 words. But they came while I was still in the parking lot finding my footing on the gravel, so he must have sent it the moment I walked away, which told me something. I will, I wrote back. I did. That was in September. By October, we had coffee twice in Guelph, halfway between us, which felt appropriately practical and also somehow charming. He was the same as he'd been at the wedding, careful with his words, honest when he chose them, curious in a way that felt genuine rather than performative. He asked about my patients, not by name but by situation. The one with the shoulder reconstruction, how's she doing? Because he remembered what I'd told him and followed up. I found this unreasonably moving. I told my brother about him on a Sunday call. My brother said, "A developer? In Toronto?" in the tone he uses when he's trying not to have an opinion, and failing. I said, "He grew up in Windsor," as though that answered everything, and somehow, for my brother, it mostly did. By November, we weren't driving to Guelph anymore. He was driving to Kitchener. Sometimes he stayed. It wasn't without friction. He traveled. A lot. There were weeks when his texts were brief and timed in different zones, and I'd feel something cold settle in my chest that I tried not to name. Once, in early December, he canceled plans 2 days in a row for a deal that was falling apart in Calgary, and I said something I shouldn't have, and he said something quieter and more precise that landed harder than if he'd shouted. We didn't talk for 4 days after that. 4 days is not very long. It felt very long. He called on the 5th day. Not a text called, I answered. I was wrong, he said. First thing, no preamble. What I said. I was stressed and I took it somewhere I shouldn't have. I'm sorry. I was quiet for a moment. I was wrong too, I said. I said things that weren't fair. You were frustrated. That was fair. I was scared, I said. It came out before I'd decided to say it. I was scared it was going to be a pattern. That you'd just keep disappearing into work, and I'd keep being understanding. And eventually, I'd stop being okay with it and you'd be surprised, even though the signs were there. He was quiet for a long moment. I've done that, he said. In other relationships. I know I've done that, and I don't want to do it with you. A pause. I don't know how to perfectly not do it. I can't promise I'll always get it right. But I want to try differently. With you, specifically. I sat in my kitchen with the December light coming in gray and flat through the window, and I thought about what it means to believe someone. Not naively, not because it's what you want to hear, but because you've watched them carefully enough to have evidence. I want to try differently too, I said. We were quiet together on the phone for a while. Outside, the first snow of the season was starting to come down. It was, I thought, a ridiculous amount of work. Being with someone. The constant negotiation between who you were before and who you're becoming in relation to another person. I'd been on my own long enough that I'd gotten good at a particular kind of efficiency. My schedule, my space, my routines, all optimized for one. The presence of another person in that structure wasn't just logistically complicated. It was emotionally excessive in a way I hadn't anticipated. Every time I let him see something, I usually kept quiet. It cost me something. And then I had to reckon with the fact that having spent it felt worth it, which was its own frightening thing. By February, he had a key to my place. Not a dramatic gesture. He was staying over a few nights a week by then. And he'd missed the building's entrance code twice in 1 week, because the panel was finicky and the code had changed, and I'd had to buzz him up at 2 in the morning when he came back late from a site visit. And we both agreed it was just practical. He didn't make a speech about it. I didn't overthink it. I just handed him the key one Thursday morning while he was making coffee, and he looked at it for a moment and then looked at me in a way that made the ordinary kitchen, the ordinary morning, feel like something I'd want to remember. Thank you, he said. It's a key, I said. I know what it is, he said, and he smiled in that way he had, just enough, and I thought, yes, this is the thing. In March, his company acquired a heritage building in Hamilton, a former textile factory near the waterfront that had been sitting empty for years. The deal had apparently been in the works since before we met, but I only found out when he mentioned it over dinner, casual, the way you mention ordinary things. I put down my fork. Hamilton? I said. The West Harbor. There's been a development plan. I grew up 3 blocks from there, I said. He looked at me. Something moved through his face. I know, he said. You told me about it. The building with the red doors that you used to walk past on the way to the corner store. You said it always looked like it was waiting for something. I stared at him. That's the one, he said quietly. I checked after you described it. I didn't know what to do with the feeling that came over me then. It was too large for the dinner table. He had remembered a detail I'd mentioned once, in passing, about a building from my childhood, and then looked it up. Not to impress me, just because it mattered to me, so it mattered to him. What are you going to do with it? I managed. Mixed use, he said. Commercial on the ground floor, residential above. We're working with a community planning group on the design. There's been consultation about affordable units. I want to get it right. He paused. I want it to be something the neighborhood is glad about. Will it be? He looked at me steadily. I'm going to try very hard to make sure it is. I believed him. That night after dinner, he asked if I wanted to drive past it. We went in the dark, parked across the street, and looked at the old factory through the windshield. The red doors were still there, a little faded. The windows were boarded, but the bones of the building were still beautiful. The brick, the long horizontal lines, the kind of architecture that doesn't happen anymore, because no one builds like that now. My grandmother used to work there, I said, suddenly remembering. In the 60s. Before it closed. She talked about it sometimes, not often, just occasionally. She said the women on her floor used to sing sometimes, in the afternoons, just to make the hours pass. Kieran was quiet. You never told me that, he said. I didn't know I remembered it until just now. He took my hand. We sat there in the dark for a while, looking at the building that had been waiting. And I thought about how strange and specific life is. How you can grow up walking past something, and your grandmother can have a history inside it you barely know. And then decades later, a man you met at a wedding can acquire it, and you can sit in a car together outside it at night. And none of that is a coincidence exactly, but it isn't fate either. It's just what happens when people pay attention to each other. I want to tell you something, he said. Okay, I said. I don't do this easily. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the building. I'm not. I'm good at work. I'm good at structure and analysis and seeing what's underneath the surface of something. I'm not as naturally good at the parts of life that don't have a structure, the parts where you just have to trust and stay present and not retreat. He paused. I retreat. I always have. It's what I do when things feel uncertain. I know, I said, and I haven't retreated from you. He looked at me then. That's not nothing for me. I thought about the 4-day silence in December, about the key on a Thursday morning, about a building with red doors that turned out to be both of ours in different ways. No, I said, it isn't nothing. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out an envelope. Plain white, sealed. My name on the front in his handwriting, which I knew by now. Small, angular, slightly left-leaning, he held it out. I wrote this last week, he said. I wasn't sure when to give it to you. I'm not sure now is right either, but I've been carrying it around for 8 days and that feels long enough. I took it. I looked at it. I looked at him. Can I read it now? If you want. I opened it carefully, the way you open something you want to keep. The letter was 2 pages. His handwriting, the same small angular script. He wrote about the first night at the lodge, what he'd noticed about me before he spoke to me. The way I was holding my Prosecco but not drinking it. The way I was looking at the boats with such concentrated attention, as though I were trying to find something in them, and being patient about not finding it yet. He wrote that he'd thought, whoever she is, she knows how to wait. He wrote about the drive back to Toronto, how he'd kept replaying the conversation, how that was unusual for him, that usually conversations moved through him and left no residue. He wrote about Windsor, about his father, more than he'd told me in person, a fuller picture, less edited. He wrote about the years after the company collapsed, and what it had cost his father in a particular kind of confidence that you can see leaving a person slowly, and how Kieran had watched that and decided very young that he would not be made helpless by structures he didn't understand. He wrote, "I know that impulse has cost me things. People, probably. I'm still learning where the line is between protecting yourself and just being afraid." Near the end, he wrote, "I don't know how to say this in person without it sounding like something other than what it is. But I know that I want to be in your life. Not as a convenience, not as a thing that's easy. I know I'm not easy. I want to be in your life the way that building is in yours. Present. Underneath things. There when you remember it." I finished reading. I folded the pages carefully. I sat with them in my hands. Outside the car, the red doors of the old factory were visible in the dark, patient and unchanged. I looked at him. He was watching me with the stillness he had sometimes, the kind that looked like calm, but was actually something held very carefully in place. "You're not easy," I said. "I know. I'm not either. I know that too." "Okay," I said. He waited. "I want to be in your life too," I said. "The same way. The real way." He let out a breath, just slightly, just enough to tell me he'd been holding it. I reached over and took his hand. He held it the way he held most things, carefully, with full attention. We sat outside that building for another hour, talking about everything and nothing, about Hamilton and Windsor, the way autumn comes in Ontario like a permission to slow down, about the women who used to sing on the factory floor in the afternoons to make the hours pass, about what it might mean for a building to finally be useful again, after years of waiting. Outside, the night was cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes everything very still, very precise, as though the world has decided to hold its breath. On the drive back to Kitchener, he drove. I had my feet tucked up on the seat and my head back, and I watched the dark highway and felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to admit. Not happiness exactly, though that was part of it. More like the particular ease of being known. Of existing in a space where someone has looked at you carefully and decided to stay looking. He walked me to my door. "Next weekend," he said. "Next weekend," I agreed. He kissed me at the door the way he'd started doing. Not hurried. Full attention on the thing at hand, and then stepped back. "Good night, Sayursay." "Good night," I said. I went inside. I sat down on my couch with my coat still on and the letter in my hand, and I thought about buildings that wait, and boats that don't move, and the strangest part isn't always what it seems like at first. The strangest part was that I hadn't been looking for any of this. I'd gone to a wedding to get through it, to be a good cousin, to survive the seating chart. I'd driven 3 hours north with low expectations and tired feet, and I'd stood at a railing, watching still water, and a man had come to stand beside me and said, "They're not moving." "I know," I'd said. "That's what I find interesting about them." And here we were.